Um, thank you. Okay, so just very briefly going to introduce myself. My name is Maria Cohut. I have a PhD in English and Comparative Literary Studies. My background is in 18th and 19th century literature, but I have a special interest in the Gothic mode across cultures and different eras. And today, this talk, as you can tell from the first slide, is going to be about revenants as abject feminine in Romanian Gothic horror. Specifically, this case study of a novella called Miss Christina that was published in 1936 and was authored by Mircea Eliade, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit in a second. Just wanted to also note that I do have contact details on that slide. You've got my university email address. Sadly, my contract will be coming to an end fairly soon, but I will still be reachable on that email address for the next few months. But you also have my personal email address should you want to get in touch with questions, comments, feedback, angry messages. No, please don't send me any angry messages. Please don't do that. Okay. So, I'm just going to, I love this. I love this image, by the way. It's digitized on the Wellcome Collection website. It's amazing. Don't know who the author is, but it's wonderful. I'm going to invite you to join me on a journey into this underworld, underbelly of Romanian Gothic horror of the 1930s, specifically through the lens of what I think is an intriguing case study, Mircea Eliade's Miss Christina. And I do admit I've tried to pack a lot of material into the talk because I'm aware that many of you here today may not have had an opportunity to read this text previously and may not be familiar with the context or with the author for that matter. So we'll have a summary of Miss Christina. I said brief. We'll see how brief. It's not super brief. Also, spoiler alert, there will be spoilers. I'm really sorry. There's no way around that, I think, if I'm going to have an interesting discussion or try and have an interesting discussion. So be aware. I'll be talking about the historical context in which this book was published, its Gothic horror quality. Then I will go on to talk a little bit about Romanian revenants, in this case, strigoi, what we call strigoi. I'll be looking at how we define strigoi and what their relation is to the abject feminine. And finally, because this novella rather, portrays a women's universe that is in sort of tension with the more patriarchal world order that it's surrounded by, I'll be asking why this domestic women's universe is so threatening to this patriarchal worldview, we're delving a little into the author's contentious political views. So we'll see about that. So who is this guy? Who is Mircea Eliade? This is him when he was younger. He was born in Bucharest, Romania in 1907. He was a writer, a philosopher, and a historian of religions. I think across the world, he is probably better known for the latter, for his history of religions, for his research and philosophical ideas. He studied Indian cultures and philosophies at the University of Calcutta and later obtained a PhD from the University of Bucharest in Romania with a thesis on yoga. So his special interest was Eastern cultures and philosophies. He wrote fiction and nonfiction in 3 languages, Romanian, French, and English, but he knew 10 languages. So on top of the ones that I've already mentioned, he also could speak German, Italian, Persian, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Bengali, and Pali, quite impressive. Moved to Chicago in 1957, where he was professor of comparative history of religions at Loyola University for a very long time, and he also died in Chicago in 1986. He was a very prolific writer. He had a vast oeuvre that he produced. uh, dozens of works of fiction, including novels, novellas, and short stories, dozens of scientific works. I said maybe 30, although don't quote me on that because I don't have a specific number, not including research articles published in specialist journals. And I'm just going to say that while he was, I think, quite widely translated at the time by his contemporaries, and especially his research works were quite widely translated into French and English. Many of these translations, especially English translations, are out of print right now and hard to find, less so the nonfiction work and more so the fiction work. And I've listed there 3 novels that you can currently find in English and order online and get delivered out of all of the many that he wrote. Diary of a Short-Sighted Adolescent, Bengal Nights, and Youth Without Youth, which is actually a novella. What about Miss Christina? So a very, very brief background on Miss Christina. Miss Christina was or is a Gothic horror novella. It was published in Romanian in 1936. Its plot is set in 1935, so a year earlier, previous to publication. The narrative is set at a country estate in the Danubian Plain in Romania, so more specifically, Câmpia Bărăganului, the Bărăgan Plain, which is in southern Romania. It has an epigraph, which is quite interesting, from Queen Mab by Shelley. It stood all beautiful in naked purity, the perfect semblance of its bodily frame. And unfortunately, it's only been translated into English once, years ago in 1992. And it's in a collected volume with a rather random title, Mystic Stories, with alongside some other works. Now that book is out of print, unfortunately. It's really hard to find. If you're based in Britain and you have access to these to these different libraries, you will be able to find it. Well, one copy at the British Library and one copy at University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies Library. And you're in luck, there is a digitized copy currently of Mystic Stories featuring Miss Christina, that can be borrowed via archive.org. I'm happy to circulate the link if needed, but if you go on archive.org and look for Mircea, Eliade, and Mystic Stories, you should be able to find it. You can't download it, but you can register for free on archive.org and borrow it and read it if you so wish. And all of the page references in this talk refer to this translation in case you're interested. So a little bit of historical context about when it was published. At the time that this book was published, it was the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Romania was a monarchy under King Carol I, and it was facing a period of intense political tensions. On the one hand, you had communist activists that were getting more and more vocal, and their views were becoming more and more uncomfortable to the establishment. And actually, 1936, the year that this book was published, famously was a year when a large trial was held against top leaders of the Communist Party at the time as part of a targeted repression effort against them. At the same time, on the other hand, you had ultra-Christian nationalist militarist movements that were gaining power and influence. Specifically, the Iron Guard, the Iron Guard, the paramilitary branch of the greater ultra-Christian nationalist movement in Romania, which is known as the Legion, which is short for the Legion of Archangel Michael, had been founded a few years earlier in 1930. At the time, the Iron Guard was outlawed, so it was outlawed shortly after its formation. However, its appeal still persisted even in elite cultural circles, and you'll understand the relevance of this a little bit later in the talk. But already, I think you can tell how these intense socio-political tensions were amply fertile ground for the creation and publication of more unusual literary works like this one. works that experimented with genre, that dove into folklore, used elements of magic and the supernatural to explore these social relations and social tensions. So Miss Christina, I think it would be appropriate to label it as a Gothic horror story. And even though both the Gothic and the horror terms are hard to define, you can't really pin down specific definitions. I will here quote and agree with David Punter. Who am I to ever disagree with David Punter? That the Gothic as a genre in general developed, quote, as a specific reaction to troubling social phenomena. And I think that is probably true of the context in which Miss Christina was produced as well. Both Punter and other critics and theorists of the Gothic, such as Anne Williams, also agree that while eschewing hard and fast definitions, works that can be described as Gothic share certain characteristics like having a more lyrical style, having subversive themes, a sense of convolutedness in the story or the setting or both, and an uneasy relationship with concepts of home and of belonging, all of which also appear in Miss Christina. And like the Gothic, horror also eschews hard and fast definitions, but as Darren Hudson Hick has argued in an article called Horror and Its Affects, it tends to evoke certain affective responses, the horror does, including feelings of dread and abjection. So, on top of this, you could say that both Gothic and horror stories are placed in settings that are or can easily turn unsettling. So you'd have in more traditional Gothic and in horror as well, derelict castles, for instance. You don't have that in Miss Christina, but you do have a mansion that is at the center of the story, the mansion of gentry past its heyday that still clings to that nostalgia for the times before, better times. Then you can have forbidding natural settings, which you do have in Miss Christina. Again, in Miss Christina, you have a forest setting, you have the Danubian plain that I previously mentioned, both of which are linked to mysterious archaeological digs and discoveries into disturbing folktales. Um, not going to go into much detail here, but just to say that Miss Christina, as a cultural artifact, does continue to hold considerable cultural currency, especially in Romania. There are two film adaptations of it. One, an earlier one, if from 1992. Not sure where you can find it if you wish to, but the 2013 one, which is the more recent one, is currently on YouTube with English subtitles, which is wonderful if you do want to watch it. And I did want to mention, I don't know why I love mentioning this. It stars Maja Morgenstern in the role of Mrs. Moscow, who is the sort of matriarch figure in Miss Christina. This is she. Maja Morgenstern and in the role of Mrs. Moscow in this film. And if you do recognize her face, which some of you may and some of you may not, it will be because she starred in Mel Gibson's 2004 film, The Passion of the Christ, and she was the Virgin Mary. Here in the middle, next to her, Monica Bellucci is Mary Magdalene. So yes, there we go. Okay, to get back to our focus for this paper, Miss Christina, to give you a summary. It's brief, but maybe not so brief because I feel like I do need to run through all of the different threads in order to give you an idea of what actually happens in the book and why it's relevant. So the book starts with a young painter by the name of Egor Pashkevich, referred to as Egor, who has come to spend the summer at the Moscow family estate following an invitation from Sanda, who is the young, attractive woman that he is seeing. And this Moscow household is an all-female household. You've got Mrs. Moscow, who we just saw, and that's still, who is the matriarch. Her 9-year-old daughter, Simina's wet nurse, Sanda, who is her eldest daughter, who invited Egor to the estate, and for a brief time, there's also someone who acts as both maid and cook for the family. So um, the story hinges on the fact that the entire Moscow family seems to have this fascination, this undying fascination or even adoration of Mrs. Moscow's dead sister, Miss Christina. She's always only referred to as Miss Christina in the novella. And Miss Christina um, died rather tragically. She was killed during the peasant uprising of 1907. And so this uprising of 1907, which incidentally is also the year that Eliade was born, happened when village folk who had been working for or who had been working on large estates turned against the gentry in order to, claim back their rights. And in Miss Christina, the Moscow estate had been caught up in this uprising, which eventually led to Miss Christina's death. So present day, there's a lifelike portrait of Miss Christina held under lock and key in her former bedroom in this estate manor house, which is kept pristinely like a temple by Mrs. Moscow, her sister. There are also other male guests that join the party. So because you've got this all-female household, right? And then you've got Egor as the sole male figure coming in. But then little by little, other male guests also join this party. You've got Professor Nazaria, who is an academic researcher. He's researching findings at a nearby archaeological dig. And then you've got, less importantly, a country doctor who's also a huntsman by the name of Panaitescu. So strange incidents are reported by the villagers nearby the estate at first, and they report animals being slaughtered in the dead of night. They report villagers, and especially younger women, falling deathly ill. And these reports are that these animal deaths and this illness are caused by the strigoi of Miss Christina, so her revenant form. The maid that we saw at the beginning of the story flees the household. She's terrified. She's also convinced that the strigoi, the revenant, is at fault. Egor starts having strange, disturbing dreams. He starts dreaming of his friend, a friend of his who had been dead for a long time, and he dreams of this friend trying to warn him of an imminent danger. But every time this friend appears to him saying, "Oh, watch out, watch out," he's always dismissed or dispersed by the figure of Miss Christina, who appears to Egor and is intent on seducing him, apparently. And at first, Egor is like, these are just nightmares, it's fine. But little by little, he starts to suspect that his dreams are not fully restricted to the dream world, and that Miss Christina might not just be a dream apparition, but that she might actually be a creature in the come to haunt him in the real world. So he can smell her signature violet fragrance in his bedroom after she's visited him at night. She can find accessories left behind by her, such as a silk glove. Then at the same time, you've got Mrs. Moscow demonstrating increasingly strange behaviors. She doesn't appear to be all there. She's walking around like a somnambulist. She walks like she's in a trance. At one point, she's reportedly found holding a pigeon whose neck she's wrung. Sanda, Egor's love interest, falls dangerously ill and mysteriously ill, which is why the country doctor that I mentioned earlier comes in. He's called in to see what's wrong with her. And then the young girl, Simina, the 9-year-old Simina, she becomes increasingly brazen. She's shameless. She's starting to tell age-inappropriate stories to Egor that she claims she's heard from her nurse, but it turns out that that's not true. The nurse says that she's an uneducated woman. She doesn't know any stories. That in fact is the other way around. It's Simina who's quite precocious, teaching her stories. Simina also seems to know intimate details of Miss Christina's life that no one else knows. She starts exhibiting disturbing hypersexual behaviors around Egor as well, and we'll talk about that in a little while. She kisses him on the lips. She practically sexually assaults him. Very disturbing, coming from this character of a 9-year-old girl. Which all of which leads to Egor and the other male guests becoming convinced that there are demonic powers at play indeed that need to be vanquished. Sanda, like I said, she's increasingly ill, but she's also terrified. She tells Egor that if he doesn't play along with what the Revenant of Miss Christina demands for him, which is sexual submission, basically, during her nocturnal visitations, she tells him that Sanda, will die. And Egor himself appears to be equally attracted by and repelled by Miss Christina as her presence intensifies and she gains more and more physicality. So he becomes torn between his affection that he's developed for Sanda, the live woman, and his lust for this Strigoi, this revenant of the dead aunt. However, in a desperate attempt to save Sanda, to save Sanda's life, he thinks, okay, if I get rid of this revenant, Sanda is going to heal. She's going to be fine again. So he decides to destroy her. He calls in the angry villagers to help him, I don't know, destroy Christina's portrait, I guess, as a kind of symbolic object of her presence and continued influence on the household. But the villagers do more than that. They set out to destroy the house. They're very angry. They carry away the valuables. So this is all in a sort of parallel to the 1907 uprising where Christina died. Egor has identified where Miss Christina's body is supposed to have been buried. He goes there. He finds the young girl Simina sort of stretched out and limp over the spot where Miss Christina's body is supposed to have been buried. Egor drives an iron stake through the spot where he thinks Christina's heart would be, at which point the young girl Simina cries out in distress, in pain. Egor himself loses consciousness at that point. And so the ending of the story basically is he passes out, he loses consciousness, and then as he comes to, he wakes up knowing that, first of all, Christina is gone. That's it. And at the same time, however, his unsatisfied lust for her will haunt him forever. And he hears from the villagers that Sanda has also died following his impaling of Christina's body. And he also hears these anonymous voices, again, probably villagers, saying that, quote, the gentry has gone to waste. So this is never really clearly specified in the story, but the implication there is very much that at the point that Egor has vanquished Christina, the Revenant, her entire family has also died. So Mrs. Moscu, Simina, and Sanda, and the entire estate has gone to waste. I'm just going to take 1 second to take a sip of. Okay. So as we proceed with the discussion, I think it's important to, first of all, understand what a strigoi is, what this Romanian type of revenant is. So some of you might be thinking of this lovely Bela Lugosi as Dracula, but that's not it. Some of you may be thinking of this when I mention a female revenant. You might be thinking of the Brides of Dracula, but she's not it. And again, we come to my favorite bit here where I've got tech that I need to work out. So I've got this, I pulled up this, it's a short film, short Romanian film from 2021. It is available on YouTube. It does have English subtitles. I'm not going to play it in full, even though it's short. But the topic of this film is, so apparently it was inspired by real events somewhere in rural Romania where someone died and came back as a revenant, causing ill to his family. And I just want to play a couple of very brief clips from this to give you an idea of what some of the attributes of the strigoi, of the Romanian revenant, might be. So please bear with me as I try and do this. Thank you, Sam. Sorry, please excuse me while I faff about with the tech. There we are. Okay, what you saw there was this guy, really mean, abusive guy, being abusive to his wife on his literal deathbed, um, and threatening that she won't be rid of him ever. Even after he dies, he's gonna come back to hurt her. So then you see her after his death being, waking up in the middle of the night, presumably after he's visited her. With we don't exactly know what's happening, but we know she's physically uncomfortable. She's scratching so hard, she's drawing blood. Then you sort of see his silhouette, a dark, strange silhouette coming to see the daughter, who again is terrified and has weird, unspecified physical symptoms. And then I haven't shown this, but at the end, they're gonna dig him out and they're gonna take out his heart in order to get rid of the Strigoi, the Revenant. So, based on some of this, what might we say are the attributes of a Strigoi in popular culture? So first of all, this is somebody who must have been inclined to evil deeds before death, right? They were already a bad person, so it makes sense that after death, they will continue to be an evil presence, malevolent presence. After death, they appear kind of as it was insinuated in that short film, not quite in spirit form, so they're not fully, I guess, invisible, untouchable, but also not quite in physical form. There's something in between, maybe. They can cause they can and do cause physical illness to remaining family members that they visit. They can possess and or cause mental illness to remaining family members, if you see possession as a form of mental illness, I guess. And to vanquish this strigoi, you have to destroy its heart. You could impale it with a stake, with an iron stake. You could remove the heart. You could take it out. You might even have to consume the heart in order to get better. So how does Miss Christina tick these all or some of these boxes? How is she a strigoi? The narrative tells us that she was already inclined to committing immoral deeds while still alive. But bear in mind, everything that we know of Miss Christina's past pretty much is a second-hand or third-hand story narrated by a man, typically narrated by a man. So here we have a quote, Professor Nazaria, who's the academic researcher, has spoken to the villagers, and he's come back to Egor and told him what the villagers report. And the villagers report that Miss Christina was the estate bailiff's mistress when she was young, maybe 16, 17, and that she was incredibly cruel. She would, quote, tell the bailiff to thrash the peasants with a whip in front of her, thrash them blood red. She would tear off their shirts and whatnot. And the man as well, the bailiff, was a beast of insane, unimaginable cruelty. As a result, bonus, Miss Christina, this sort of malevolent, sexually incontinent Miss Christina dies a violent death. So the bailiff kills her out of jealousy. Why does he kill her out of jealousy? Again, Professor Nazaria reports what the villagers have told him. He says that during the uprising of 1907, when the villagers were unhappy, quote, people say that the peasants on other lands had come to the estate, and she summoned them into her bedroom, 2 by 2, ostensibly to divide her goods. But in fact, she would let them all take turns in abusing her. She encouraged them herself. She received them in twos, lying naked on the rug. So, of course, when the bailiff finds out, he comes in, he sees this debauchery, he shoots her, mad with jealousy. What other boxes does she tick as a strigoi? She causes living family members to fall ill. Sanda falls deathly ill after Miss Christina's strigoi, after her revenant. She comes to Egor in her revenant form. Sanda's illness is also in the story alluded to as a feminine kind of ill, something mysteriously tied to periods, to period blood, taboo topic, weird, disgusting. And then there's a question mark there. We're going to discuss this. She possesses her young niece, Simina. Simina seems to have a strange, very close bond with Miss Christina. She acts strangely, unnaturally for her age, and we're going to come back to that. Then she is also intent on a different kind of possession, on sexually possessing Egor. She's intent on seducing him. She comes to him at night in increasingly corporeal and touchable form. As I previously briefly mentioned, first leaves behind her perfume, then a glove, and then finally appears to him fully naked, and she's ready to offer her body to him, which he rejects. But as that happens, she's basically placed some kind of curse on Egor, which does come to fruition. Either he fully gives into her, or he will crave her, he will lust for her forevermore, tormented by his unsatisfied desires until the hour of his death. But I was mentioning, what is the relationship between Simina and Christina? Is Christina actually possessing Simina from beyond the grave? Simina is a very strange character. She tells these unusual, unsettling stories. She tells Egor disturbing fairy tales, like this one that I quoted here about a shepherd boy that was fated to love a dead empress. And this dead empress will also fall in love with him. So she's foreshadowing kind of Miss Christina's passion for Egor from beyond the grave. She seems to possess knowledge well beyond her years. So is Simina possessed by Christina, or is something else happening here? In order to find out, very briefly, I'm going to give you the attributes of the Strigoi, of the Revenant, according to Mircea Eliade himself. So Mircea Eliade himself, being this historian of folk and culture and religion, studied and wrote about this. And in his argument is, and this is from a journal article that he published in 1975, his argument is, first of all, that Strigoi, the Romanian Revenant, has some kind of cultural and etymological connection to the witch. Quote, he writes, quote, the vocable striga became, so from Latin, became strigoi in Romanian, meaning witch, either as a living witch or a dead one, in this case, a vampire. And then he goes on to say, strigoi possess supernatural powers. For instance, they can enter houses with locked doors. They carry out all the evil doings characteristic of witches, bring epidemics among men and cattle. They can transform themselves into dogs, cats, wolves, horses, pigs, toads, and other animals. So to recap, for Mircea Eliade, there are kind of two categories, dead and living. Living strigoi, more like witches, dead as well, but living more like witches. They possess supernatural powers and can cast spells. They can bypass locked doors. They can make domestic animals ill, and they can turn into animals. So what can we think? Can we think that Simina perhaps is a strigoi herself? I don't know if I can decisively make that argument. This is unclear. But what is clear is that her character does share the closest bond with Miss Christina, who she never knew when she was alive. Ximena frequently reports dreams of and visitations from Miss Christina. At the beginning of the novella, she even reports that, quote, Miss Christina came to my bed and said, "You're the only one who loves me, Ximena." So they have this bond of affection. She reports having dreamt Christina as she was when alive, knows details of her life, intuitively, perhaps knows her burial spot. She looks after Miss Christina's cherished earthly possessions like her Belle Epoque carriage, and she knows what Christina in Revenant form wants of Egor and repeatedly tells Egor. There's a clear blurring of boundaries and personalities between the character of Ximena and Miss Christina. Ximena doesn't act innocent. She doesn't act childlike. She's described as hypersexual. She seems to even cast disturbing sexual spells on Egor herself. So at one point, Egor has followed Ximena into a cellar space where we will later see that Miss Christina is also buried. So she's followed Ximena into the cellar space. And as he does so, he sort of falls into this trance-like state. And I put some quotes there from the scene that are quite telling. So Ximena speaks in a strange, maybe almost woman-like voice. How strange that unknown voice sounded on Ximena's small red lips. Egor felt the poison in his blood, an insane beastly appetite coursing through his body. So he tries to dispel this trance by thinking of Sanda, but he can't. He only heard the little girl's bewitched voice. And then we see that Ximena is at that point able to hold him entirely in her power, even though she is, remember, just a 9-year-old girl. She's a little girl. Sit down, the little girl commanded, and he does. His limbs were burning, his hands shaking. He felt Ximena's body close. Uh-oh, disturbing. What a fool you are, Ximena said to him. So weak. And just a little content/trigger warning about the content on the next slide. So I don't even know what to say it is, if I should say it's child abuse, sexual harassment, all of the above. It is disturbing, but essentially at this point, Egor begins to, I don't know, fall into this sort of spell of almost erotic attraction. Maybe it is fully erotic. He began kissing Ximena's hands. His breathing grew difficult and hot. And we can see here that Ximena, the little girl, isn't satisfied. She doesn't want to be kissed this way, doesn't want her hands kissed. She says to him, "You shall kiss me as I want you to." She pressed her mouth on his, biting into his lips. Egor felt unspeakable happiness, heavenly and holy in his flesh. He abandoned himself to that kiss of blood and honey. The little girl had crushed his lips, wounding them. Her unripe body remained cold, slim, fresh. Feeling the blood, Ximena lapped it thirstily. But she soon sprang to her feet. And here I haven't put down the whole scene, but here there's this almost sadomasochistic dom sub scene where she asks him to kiss her shoe in a sign of obedience, and he does, and so on and so forth. So we've got Ximena being disturbingly hypersexual. We also have some strange occurrences happening in the narrative, and we don't really know who causes them. Intuitively, we might say that they're caused by Miss Christina in her revenant form, but could they be caused by Ximena? So domestic animals die violently, like I said, in the village, and Miss Christina's Strigoi is blamed by the villagers, but we also have Ximena often absent at key moments in the narrative. She's wandering through the estate grounds late at night, fully on her own, so we don't actually know what she's doing. Then we've got Sanda, who is kept by Egor under lock and key in her bedroom so she doesn't get, I guess, assaulted by the Revenant. And yet she doesn't seem to be safe even when her bedroom is locked. But we don't really know who's making her unsafe. Then we have swarms of mosquitoes infesting the house at night if any windows are left open. These mosquitoes that suck the blood out of anybody within in their proximity, except for two characters, Mrs. Moscow and implicitly Simina. So I think both Simina and Miss Christina, whether or not we choose to think of Simina as a revenant as well, some form of revenant, or whether we choose to think of her as possessed by the revenant, I think they both align with this idea of the abject or monstrous feminine as outlined by Barbara Creed in The Monstrous Feminine. And Barbara Creed thinks of the female vampire in film, but I think this also applies to these vampiric female creatures in novels, in literature. So Creed describes the female vampire as a creature that does not respect the dictates of the law, which set down the rules of proper sexual conduct. And she also represents abjection because she crosses the boundary between the living and the dead, the human and the animal. Creed draws on Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection that is associated with taboo, with taboo around femininity and female bodily functions. Quote, the abject threatens life. It must be radically excluded from the place of the living subject. And indeed, the male characters in this story reach the same conclusion that these, especially Miss Christina, is abject, that she threatens life, and she must be radically excluded. She must be vanquished. So I've got how is Miss Christina abject or monstrous? She's undead, she's sadistic, she's a nymphomaniac. She, as a revenant, in her revenant form, she has broken the laws of nature. She doesn't stay dead when she should be dead. She takes whatever she wants, whatever men she wants. She's unashamed of her erotic desires in death as in life. She might be described as child snatching if we think of her as possessing this child, Simina. Then we've got Simina. How is she abject and monstrous? Well, she's hypersexed. She's unnatural, got unnatural desires. She's undisciplined and refuses to be disciplined. So whenever, especially Sanda and Egor, they try to discipline her, and she laughs in their faces, basically. She's got inappropriate behaviors. She's sadistic as well, as we saw, and she is disturbingly comfortable with death and the dead, of course, because she has this close relationship with Miss Christina as a revenant. But I would also add that the abject and the monstrous qualities also in this novel also extend to the other female characters. They extend to Mrs. Moscow, the matriarch, who's morbid. She's obsessed with her dead sister. Um, she's kind of dead in life herself because she acts as if she's always in a trance, hypnotized. She's portrayed as kind of barbaric. She's got unladylike eating habits. At the description of a meal at the start of a book, we're told that they serve ram's meat that has a sickening smell, and nobody else can touch it, but she touches it. Not only does she touch it, she eats it with a lot of gusto, with her usual appetite. Just bending over the plate, really focused on enjoying that disgusting cut of meat. She also is sadistic. She kills pigeons by wringing their necks, and she's a neglectful mother because she never knows where Simina is. She's just always, the little girl is always just wandering around on her own. Sanda as well, this might sound surprising, but Sanda is initially portrayed as quite flirtatious as well. To begin with, Egor seems to see her as a fling, as an easy catch, as an object of sexual desire, sexual seduction, more than as a potential life partner. Later, she becomes sickly with these insinuated female ills that are mysterious and disgusting. She seems to be anxiety-ridden. On the one hand, she doesn't want Egor to leave and leave her alone. She also doesn't want Egor to take her away from the estate because she's afraid she's going to die if he does so. She's codependent on Mrs. Moscu and even on the spectre of Miss Christina. And also Simina's nurse, who doesn't appear very often in the narrative, but every time that she does appear, she seems to be complicit with Simina's inappropriate behaviors. It's also the right environment for the monstrous feminine to develop this Danubian plain, with all the talk of archaeological digs from the professor and of ancient idols buried by the Moscow family estate. And the monstrous feminine is associated with bodies of water, often in Western, by which I mean European cultures. And in the book, while the Danube, the actual body of water, isn't close enough, it's also not too far away. It's a kind of described as a kind of borderland of sorts that these characters inhabit. There's a sense of decay there. There are mosquitoes that bring infectious diseases and pestilence. The estate is surrounded by forests, both ancient and new. Mr. Nazaria, the professor, claims that the sort of ancient Danubian spirit, in a way, is almost haunting this plain. He talks about the smell. He says it isn't the smell of water. It's not a humid air. It's rather a stagnant smell, like the smell of clay and thistles. You sometimes feel as if whole forests must have been rotting very far away. He talks about a scent both complex and elementary. So this sense of decay and mystery. So what happens when Egor and the other men take action and bring down the House of Moscow? We've got Mrs. Moscow here with Simina and Sanda, kind of like three weird sisters. By the way, these are all stills from the 2013 film adaptation. To reestablish this sense of a patriarchal order, we've got Egor and the other male guests setting out to vanquish the spectre of Miss Christina, which presides over the Moscow household. By eliminating Miss Christina's revenant form, the Strigoi, if we consider Miss Christina as the matriarch de facto, as the female presence with the most influence over the household, by vanquishing her, then Egor is sure to become the patriarch. He's sure to have the influence, right? He will marry Sanda. He will re-educate Simina. He will relegate Mrs. Moscow to the margins, where the mentally unwell belong. But what he doesn't seem to realize is that the entire house, the entire estate, is built on the foundations of female bonds, female relationships, and on perhaps their shared sense of trauma. So one point that is quite salient in the book is that Mrs. Moscow is convinced that Christina, who was her older sister, died instead of her, right? When the uprising starts, Mrs. Moscow says that she is sent to another family estate where she's kept safe, whereas Christina stays behind and thus is killed, which means that Mrs. Moscow is the only one left to continue the family line, which she does by having two daughters. And we also know that Mrs. Moscow must have had a husband once upon a time. She's always referred to as Mrs., so we know she is or was married. But he's never mentioned. He's entirely absent from the narrative. There are no brothers, there are no uncles, there are no grandfathers. Just this sort of unholy trinity of Mrs. Moscow and the two daughters under the rule of the dead aunt, Miss Christina. And while this shared bond is at times uncomfortable, it is also unbreakable, which Sanda knows. Remember when Egger suggested stealing her away from the estate, or trying to somehow get to the bottom of the mysterious hauntings of Miss Christina, Sanda begs him not to do anything, not to take any action, or she will die. And of course, she does die. It does come to happen when he attacks Miss Christina's body underground. Sanda does die, as do implicitly her sister and her mother, and the entire estate seems to physically collapse. And what are we to make of this? So I'm just going to take another sip of my drink. Okay, so you might accuse me now that I've buried the lead this in the entire time, but I think now is the time to mention, and I think this may be relevant in how we may or may not want to read this story. But Mircea Eliade, although later scholars have tried to find excuses for his beliefs, he was notoriously a sympathizer of the Iron Guard, so the extremist, ultra-Christian nationalist movement in Romania at the time. He was even jailed for sympathizing with them for a while. And the scholarly debate still persists to this day, of course. There are many that would argue that he did change his ideas and that he reneged on the Iron God. I am not a specialist in this particular side of things. I haven't done enough research, I admit, but it is unclear to me that he ever changed his sympathies and his ideas. Also, I want to say that notoriously, though again, there are many scholars, Eliade scholars, that would disagree with me or gloss over this. He had quite misogynistic views that were also made visible in some of his other literary works. Um, and on top of this, he had there's like this key concept in his philosophy that he calls the terror of history, which is a very vague concept. He doesn't ever fully define it, I think. Um, but some Eliade scholars have tried to define or characterize it, and they say that this terror of history, which for Eliade sort of haunts our world order, is, quote, a feeling of dread and hopelessness brought about by the great catastrophes of the 20th century. It kind of makes sense. It aligns with this idea of political and social tensions that are fertile ground for Gothic and horror fiction. But it also aligns with, I think, the ideas of and the philosophies, if we want to call them that, of the Iron God, because one element that made the God and the Legion more or less unique among other fascist factions and movement in Europe at the time was its strong claim to spirituality, and especially to Christian spirituality. And the Iron God also had this notion that the current world order is sinful, that it is haunted by past sins, and these sins are violent, and we have to fight violence with violence. And through destruction, we're gonna get to the core of a new world order, of a new spiritual nation, right? So I think through all of these things, I know I've thrown a lot of you. You could say that there are two perspectives that coexist in the narrative of Miss Christina. You could say that might influence the way that we read it. You could say that on the one hand, we have Christina's own historic trauma. Um, so potential her potential abuse, the violence that she inflicted and suffered, that haunts the all-female household of the Moscow family, right? And on the other hand, you could say that Christina herself is a historical terror that is haunting Egor and the other men in the narrative. So again, what are we to make of all this? Um, does reestablishing establishing or re-establishing a world order or a patriarchal order lead to chaos? Or does it lead to chaos first and then to something better, to a renewal? Clearly, Ego's efforts to establish what he perceives as order eventually lead to further decay and chaos. So the family of Moscow is extinguished. But then again, what perspective should we take here? Are we supposed to think that the fall of the landed gentry, as represented by the Moscow family, is a step in the right direction because they were all cruel anyway? Are we supposed to think that the fall of this landed gentry of the Moscow family is a tragedy because actually, at least some of them, Sanda was a modern young woman. She had hope. She was part of a different world, a different system, but she was only brought down by this terror of history symbolized by Miss Christina. So visiting the sins of the mothers upon the daughters, etc. Or, putting the class questions aside, or on top of the class questions, maybe the struggle questions. Is this all-female household itself unnatural because it's all female and therefore inevitably doomed? They can't exist without men. Or is it inherently oppressed by male interference and destroyed by male interference into this established order of this female society, basically? Then is Christina, the character of Miss Christina, and this question has stuck with me, is she a perpetrator or is she a victim? So she is portrayed as a perpetrator, as cruel, as oversexed, and with vampiric tendencies even in life. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that her story is consistently told through male voices. And there's a bit in the original text about the scene of when she gives herself to the peasants in the uprising, right? In the original text, the word that is used is a word for rape, siluire, but this word literally means taking pleasure against somebody's will. So what the text is actually saying is that Miss Christina encouraged the villagers to take their pleasure against her will. How is that possible? That's a contradiction in terms. How could she encourage them to take their pleasure against her will? And of course, we've got Simina. Again, is her character, the little girl's character, is she a degenerate? Is she a revenant? Is she a witch? Or is she just a neglected little girl that was brought up on violent stories and violent histories? The bottom line for me is again more questions. So it's clear that the men in the story are unequivocally destructive and they bring destruction to the women and curses upon themselves. And that, but are we supposed to think that man's world, which is logical and reasonable, and women's world, which is supposedly driven by law and superstition, are doomed to remain at odds? That both are fighting for power, but only one can have it, and only if the other perishes? Right? I think, again, I'm coming back to this idea that I don't know if Eliade intended to have it or not, possibly not, but to this idea that the Iron God, right, the ultra-nationalist faction, believed that first you had to cause destruction and even self-destruction, which the Iron Guard portrayed as self-sacrifice, of course, in order to transcend this sort of violence inherent in the current world order and establish a new world order and obtain a Christian spiritual nation. So is this what's happening in this book? I don't know. Gonna leave you to think about that. And thank you. And I'm gonna turn on the lights because it's really dark in here.